We're continuing this sermon series called The Day. And it's about the great and glorious day of the Lord when God's goodness overtakes evil. And I've said this every week, and I'm going to continue saying it, but I want you to read that last statement, when God's goodness overtakes evil, as not God defeating somebody else's evil, but He's defeating the evil that's right here. And we should all be pointing to our chest, right? The defeat evil that is right in front of us. That when God is taking over, overtaking that evil there. And we've done a lot. If you remember at the beginning of this, when we started talking about the day of the Lord, is that it's kind of these big things. And the first week was about the first chapters of Genesis, that big, the fall, right? When they ate the fruit and they wanted to be like God. And then we saw that again they wanted to be like God, and Cain and Abel, one of them killed the other one, right? And then they wanted to be like God again, defining what was right and wrong in their own eyes with the flood. And then they wanted to be like God again when they wanted to make a name for themselves at the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babylon, right? Remember that? So that we talked about that, and that's the kind of the beginning, and we see all these great days of the Lord coming onto them, and then we see His people ended up being thrust into slavery in Egypt, and they remembered how that felt in their slavery, and they came, and how God pulled them out of their slavery, pulled them out of their brokenness, pulled them out into and saved them, and they remember the day. They remember it by celebrating the Passover, which our Last Supper looks a lot like the Passover. And so whenever we celebrate that, we remember the day when God saved us. And in that remembering the day, God wants us to remember what He saved us from. Because in that remembering what He saved us from, it's so that we do not retreat to it once again. So in their time, they said, remember to not have slaves, because out of slavery I saved you. Remember, do not take advantage of the weak around you. Take care of the widows, take care of the poor, all those things. But we get into the reign of King Solomon, right? And he starts chasing after Egyptian horses. He starts chasing after the things of Egypt, the things of Babylon, the things of strength and power, the things of all those stuff. And we end up seeing that in that process of him chasing after, he ends up having slaves build the temple of God. That's not good. That's in the biblical understanding of things, that's about as bad as it gets. All right? And so then we have this idea, and it's one we're kind of talking about today, is that if God almost seems to be saying to the Israelites, if you want to be like the powerful around you, if you want to be like the Assyrians, if you want to be like Egypt, if you want to be like Babylon, then why don't you just become them? And we see that's what's going on in the exile. But right before that, there's this prophet that's causing problems. This prophet is named Amos, right? And Amos, you have to kind of picture this guy that kind of comes down from the mountains, kind of comes down from the hills. He probably maybe smells a little weird or something like that. Like he's big into things like raw water. I don't know if that's kind of a new thing now. Anyone heard of that yet? Cool. I love when jokes fail. It's like a new thing. Anyway, so he comes out of the hills and he says some really weird stuff, and he's speaking for God. In fact, all right, I got to be honest with you guys. We preached last summer. We did all the minor prophets. We called it the minor leagues. We had a hard time just not preaching that sermon again. We're like, I doubt that many people remember it. We did that. But we're going to have a different angle to it. But if you want to find out more about Amos, last summer we did a whole sermon on Amos. So I encourage you to look up that. You can find it on the website. You can find all the sermons on the website, BTW. And so if you ever want to watch one of them again, they're all there. But let's look at what Amos says. So this guy who comes from the hills, and he's speaking for God. He's one of the prophets. And in 5 verse 21, it says, this is what God is saying, I hate and I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I'm not going to accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look to them. Well, let's see here. Take away from me the noise of your songs and the melody of your harps. I'm not going to listen to them. But let justice roll down like waters. Let righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So let's ask ourselves the obvious question first. Does God appear happy? No, right? He's not accepting any of them. Like, they have all these rites and these rituals that they're doing, all these sacrifices, like all these things. Is he accepting any of them? No. Why? It's because it's become empty, right? It's become empty. It's become meaningless. It's just become this empty thing that they do to make it feel like they're trying to appease the gods, right? Like, it's become this empty thing that they have done, and Amos is calling them out on it. Now, this sermon has a threatening air of being a rough sermon on everyone, so I'm going to bring some levity into it, all right? So I think we do this all the time. We kind of hit on some, we try to hit the buttons that may hit nostalgia, or it's like, oh, I love that. And I kind of think we kind of tend to do that. I think a Dodge Ram, it's not really Dodge anymore, I think a Ram truck ad tried to do this the other day. Now, I have issues with this ad, and we're going to watch it now. I'm going to see if you guys can guess what my issue with it is. You probably have seen this if you watched any sporting event.
Long live Spirit, and long live the truck with the strength to keep the faith. Ram, proven to last.
What's my issue with it? It's a church. Where'd they take the church? Middle of nowhere. It's like, well, we're keeping the faith away from you. Like that's Ram is it's the sign of the beast. That's what it is. That's what it is. But it's that they're over there. Even there's a kid all dressed in a little suit. He wants to run. He's trying to get into the church, and they won't let him. Right? Like that's all that stuff. I remember the first time I saw that ad, I was like, "What? What is this?" Yeah, they took it out to the middle of nowhere. Like they're hitting on all these nostalgia and church. Dodge is upkeeping the church. No, they're taking it out in the middle of nowhere, right? And I think that's kind of the idea that Amos is getting at. He goes, you have all these things that it's like, oh, I love this big American brand is talking about Christianity, but they're not talking about bringing it to anybody. It's all just an empty ritual so they can sell you a $50,000 truck. That's all it is. That's all it is. Like that's like it looks at that, it's like, oh yeah, look at that good, strong values coming from the Ram brand. But in the actuality, there's nothing behind it. There's nothing behind it, right? Like that's what's going on in that ad, and that's what Amos is railing against. He says all this stuff is just empty. If you want to look at the substance of what you actually love, it looks like Babylon, it looks like Assyria, it looks like Egypt. You are enslaving people. You are taking advantage of the poor. You are holding people down. You are trying to hold down the widows rather than build them up. You're trying to do all this. You're trying to look like the strong ones around you. And he goes, and God's justice is going to roll down like water. God's justice is going to roll down in water. And I think a good example of this is like this can here. Nice can of Coke, right? Like, these are like engineering marvels. Have you ever thought about what an engineering marvel this is? Because think about it. You go to Sam's or the grocery store or something like that. Like they'll probably have it in like the shape of a flower or something like that coming up. But think about the amount of weight that's on the bottom set of cans there. That's a lot of weight. Have you ever picked up a case of these? they're heavy, right? Like it's everything I can do to carry like 4 in, like you're breaking your fingers off as you come in because you don't want to make 2 trips out to the car, right? Like it's heavy, but when these things are full, right, and they're sealed, they can hold a ton of weight. As you can see, we deal with it every day. But how strong is this thing when it's empty and open? Like it becomes the most flimsy thing in the world, right? Like I'm not that strong, right? Like I'm not that strong. I just crushed it easily. I was going to curse at my foot, but none of you could probably see that. And I might have gotten it on my white robe, and Claren would have gotten upset with me. Like that's because she watches the robes. But it just becomes empty and it's weak. It still looks the same, but it's empty and weak. And that's kind of the idea, is that they wanted to appear strong. They wanted to appear, see, God, we're still doing all the right things. But we got all this stuff over here. They wanted to go, look, God, we're still doing all the right things, but we still all want the strength of the nations around us. We still want the strength of the nations. We still want the strength of Babylon. We want the strength of Assyria. We want the strength of Egypt. We want the strength of the world. But Amos is saying it's weak. It's weak. And I could talk about this at length, but that'd be no fun. Instead, I'll tell you a story. All right? And the story is about a girl named Elizabeth. All right? And Elizabeth, and this is a time before me. It's probably all of your time, right? But it's a time before me. And Elizabeth loved to go swimming. All right? She loved to go swimming, but her parents didn't have a whole lot of money, and they didn't have enough money to pay for her to go swimming every day, and it was summer, school was out, and she wanted to go swimming so bad, she was trying to figure out a way to get money so she could go swimming, right? And she was a cunning little girl, right? And she was a cunning girl, and she was boo-hooing about not being able to swim one day, and she looked in the newspaper, and the newspaper had a special kids section. And then that special kids section had a place where the kids could write a letter in, and they would choose a letter of the week. And you know what would happen if you got a letter of the week? You'd get a cash prize that was enough to go swimming all summer long, even maybe some ice cream on the way home, right? Like it was this big cash prize, and little Elizabeth was like, oh man, I've got to write a letter in. So she gets up to her desk, sets up, she's like, I got to write the letter of a century here, right? Like I gotta write this because I want to go swimming. And so she had heard her grandmother say a couple of times, because her grandmother never threw away her used tinfoil, that she was saving it she was saving the used tinfoil so that at some point it could be recycled, and if everyone saved it together, then they could buy a guide dog for a blind person, all right? And something nice, it was a lie, she found out later from her grandmother. Her grandmother just didn't want her in her business. You guys don't do that to your grandkids, do you? Never? Wow, you guys are good, holy people. Never pulling the wool over your kids' eyes. Over there. But so she goes, that's a good idea. I'll tell the newspaper that I'm doing that. And so she writes this grandiose letter about how she is home for the summer, and in her spare time, she is collecting used tinfoil so that she can recycle it and donate it so a blind person can have a guide dog. All right. Well, she waits a week. And she grabs the paper, opens it up, and there's her letter right there, right underneath the one that was the letter of the week. There was like Billy and a story about he and his dog. Dumb dog, right? Like that's it was just Billy and his dog, and she's like, no swimming this summer. And she kind of moped around for another week trying to think of another scheme, and then they got a call from the newspaper. And the newspaper said, what do you want to do about these used tinfoils that keep showing up? Right? Like, so people started sending in the used tinfoils, not cleaned, right? Like, into the newspaper, and they're like, it's starting to smell, and we can't keep it here. And so they had to transport it to their house, and people kept on sending these used tinfoils, right? Kept sending and sending and sending them, and they were starting to pile up all over the place. And Elizabeth's mother was like, I'm not too pleased with this, because it was starting to smell bad. And they ended up figuring out a place to take those used tinfoils, but she was worried that she might actually die by used tinfoil inhalation, right? Like she actually thought she was going to do that. But that story is kind of funny, but she wanted to have the appearance of strength, right? Wanted to have that, like, I'm going to get this letter, I'm going to write some tall tale, but it ended up kind of biting her. People took her seriously, didn't they? Like they did all that. And I think we do a lot of the same things, that we work so hard on our exterior and how we appear that we want to make ourselves look strong. We want to make ourselves like Elizabeth, or we want to make ourselves like Israel or Egypt or Babylon, where we're building up an exterior that's actually void of mercy, sacrifice, and love. And Amos says, watch out, because the empty will soon fall and be crushed. This empty will be crushed like this can here. He says, watch out. You're looking forward to the day of the Lord, but it's not going to be a day of light. It's going to be a day of darkness. See, Amos is trying to get us away from our empty lives. And he starts saying, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Let it purify the land around it. And and this is where we see the incredibleness of God. This is where we see this, that God always seems weak. Like, when God takes his people out of Egypt, when he pulls his people out of Egypt, he grabs a guy who can't talk well, right? Like, God could probably send a holy wind and destroy all of Egypt and just pull them out, right? But he uses Moses. Why does he do that? In our Amos thing, it even says that the root of David will come. David was nothing spectacular. He was the smallest of all of his brothers. Yet David, this weak thing, conquered Goliath. Like, this seems like this is how God works, and this is exactly what we see on the cross. Because the disciples kept expecting this super strong God to overtake Rome, and instead they see God come in weakness and die on a cross. It seems like righteousness and justice rolled down onto the grave. But yet, that's the whole thing. That in his weakness and in the ruin of it all, he's actually strong. And we see that his power is actually perfected in this weakness, and he ends up being raised to life. And Amos speaks about this. He goes, in that weakness and the ruin and the weakness of Israel, he says there's a day coming when the root of David will shoot up, and it will bring restoration to the cities, and they will be dripping with fine wine. That sounds like a pretty good day. When the wine is flowing like water or something like that, right? Like that sounds like a fine day. And Amos says in beautiful poetry, all of this in Amos chapter 9. It's a little too long for me to read. I encourage you to read it when you get home today. But we see that this is what happens with Jesus, that he takes on our weakness and brings us through the cross. That the day of the Lord, the day of darkness, the day of bleak, the day that you thought was going to be light, ends up being the day the very light was created out of died. And he takes on our weakness to bring resurrection. So let's go back to Elizabeth, right? So they end up finding a place to kind of store all these tinfoils that are coming in, kind of a nonprofit. And she kind of forgot about it. And as she was trying to scheme more to go swimming whenever she could, she was trying to get to that pool whenever she could. And a couple weeks later, actually probably about a month later, that little charity that they were sending it to said, hey, all those tinfoils that you collected, all those tinfoils that you sent in and all of that, they were actually enough. They were able to recycle all of those, and we were able to buy a guide dog for a local blind person. This is a true story, by the way. It's a true story. If you want to listen to it, it's on the Moth podcast, and I can get you that link if you want to. But listen, the point of all of this is Israel had gone into selfishness, that God's people had gone into selfishness, that they had tried to build themselves up like the Romes and the Babylons and the Assyrians and Rome. But the reality was that they were just an external weakness. They were just external strength, that they were just like an empty can. But God ended up using that weak vessel to come as one of us and save the entire world. Think about that for a second. God came into Israel who was struggling, right? Who had failed. And through that failure, brought life to us all. Just imagine what he can do through your life. Just imagine what he can do through your failures in your past life. Just imagine what can happen there, because we all try to build ourselves up, but God still comes in by the Holy Spirit and fills us all with that Spirit, so that we may have life in his name and be able to bring life and his blessings to all those people around us. And that's great news. That's great news of Christian hope. So stop looking to yourself for strength, but rather in your weakness be filled with the one who causes sweet wine to drip from the vineyard, to quote Amos. And be filled with the Spirit of the one who gives you his life. Amen.